you could delve into that. Maybe, you could say this whatever this thing is that you might relate to as Lord is guidance, is clarity, is direction. And so I think that, there's a lot that I kind of spun out on, but I think when you bring it back to the business sense, it's how do we practice that radical presence in the mode of the philosophical midwife to help the individual um, give birth to what wants to come through them in a way that's healthy, so then they can look at it and they can see, like Socrates says, is it a true birth or is it a false birth? How to give birth in a clean way. But then, reflecting that back, helping the individual see, well, what is it that's coming through, and how does that reflect back on my operating system and my beliefs? So a lot of it has to do with working with beliefs, working with cognitive frameworks, cognitive frames.
Hi, welcome to the Fools and Sages podcast. We're very excited today to welcome Joshua Beneventi. Joshua is an anthropologist, philosopher, founder, coach, consultant, and is currently the North American ambassador for Logos Publishing. Joshua, welcome. So happy to have you.
It's great to be here.
You have a really interesting, unusual background. Maybe talk to us about where you're coming from and what some of your kind of formative experiences have been.
Hmm. I think that the core theme of my life has been understanding and integration. I was born and raised in San Diego, California, to a blue collar working class into a working class family. So I didn't come from a very educated environment. I found that when I was young, I was interested in things that seemed very very strange or out of place for the environment that I was in. So asking my parents if I could go to the bookstore and buy Homer's Iliad and Odyssey, or a version of a text kind of highlighting the some ancient manuscripts, some illuminated manuscripts. For example, one I can remember is the Book of the Kells, this Celtic illuminated text, I think, of the Gospels. And I just had this fascination with things that were old, or seemed to exude wisdom. And that started at a very young age, and it was definitely nurtured, especially by my mother, I think. And as time went on, that found different expressions. So I found that I had a knack and an intense desire to learn languages. So part of my family is Portuguese, though we didn't grow up speaking Portuguese in the home. We were exposed to the cultural events, and my great grandmother and grandmother, they spoke the language, but I was never taught the language. And that generation of people, in the 50s, 60s, when they immigrated, it was kind of the thing to Americanize as much as possible, due to various things, discrimination, just a general sense of wanting to fit in and function in this society. But I really exerted myself to become fluent in the language. So, and that's kind of where I connect to Logos, because Logos is based or started in Brazil, and that's a whole nother uh, rabbit hole that we could go down. But in general, in my trajectory, my background was always just like an insatiable curiosity and desire to understand where we come from. Somebody we have this actually there was a show recently that came out that nobody really has watched it. I don't think been picked up, or has a large viewership. But some friends that I went to high school with, they created a show called The End of the Eight. And at the end of the 8 freeway, you find Ocean Beach, here in San Diego, California. And I grew up in Ocean Beach. And I kind of find that it's curious, this notion of like of edges and borders. And California is at the westernmost edge of the West, in a sense, before you reach this great expanse of the Pacific Ocean. And I grew up at the end of the 8, so like kind of at the very end. And there's a lot of people talking about the kind of trying to draw some parallels between the end of the Roman Empire, and what's going on in the United States right now or something. And I don't necessarily think that I ascribe to that narrative, but I do find it's interesting that having grown up in not a highly educated family at the end of the eight, kind of at the end of the West, and feeling like I've got to figure there's something beneath all of this. There's something I know that there's something about the human experience that makes sense, that there's an order, and that I can find it. Um, but I had to, I had to dig, I had to mine, I had to go wide and far and high and low to make sense for myself without really any very little direction. Um, how do I make sense of this seemingly very almost dystopian culture that I'm growing up in? And knowing that, but having this like inherent faith that there's something beautiful about the human experience and about human culture that I can find. And so I guess that's been kind of the how you might characterize my journey is one of seeking in different cultures, different languages, different wisdom traditions, and that's brought me here today.
What are a few of those different cultures, different wisdom traditions, different experiences that you've gotten yourself into?
Many and my obviously kind of started with my own roots. I had this belief that I needed to understand my own history, my own family lineage. So my connection to predominantly the Portuguese culture. I'm mainly Portuguese and Italian with a few. I'm kind of a mutt, but uh, I had most proximity to my Portuguese heritage, and so that was number one. And then early on, also, I was very interested in the Arabic language, and as there's obviously a connection between the Islamic history in the Iberian Peninsula and my own Portuguese heritage. So I kind of followed that arc or that route in that direction, and eventually I got my first degree, actually, my associate's degree in Arabic at a local community college here, where there's a high concentration of Iraqis. So not only just any Arabic, but Iraqi Arabic, and then also Aramaic, because I was exposed to. I was in classrooms with all these aunties and uncles that had come over from Iraq, Christian Chaldeans. So it was a very interesting ethnographic experience at that time of life. Um, and then, of course, the Islamic philosophical tradition, the religion in general, was always of great interest to me. And of course, somebody at my age, having grown up and as a young boy, like witnessing what happened with 9/11 and being again not in a very educated environment where um, that was understood with nuance, but that maybe the common rhetoric and that mass media was pushing around that event was I was very not necessarily influenced by it, but affected by it. So any sort of interest, my this organic interest that I had in the Arabic language and in Islam and these things, it was something that I had to actually kind of, when it found public expression. I talked about it, or when I around my family, it was almost like this is, oh, you can't go there. This is a no no. This is because they were very swept up and not only the dominant media narrative, but also the very kind of right non-denominational Christian um, rhetoric around things. So I had some I wouldn't call it any adversity, but just sort of noticing that, oh, my interests are outside of the bounds of what is considered to be, acceptable or valid, kind of, at least in my familial context. So that's been a big one for me. Lots of indigenous traditions in my undergraduate degree at the University of California, San Diego. I wrote my thesis on West African diaspora religions, specifically in Brazil, specifically Candomblé, which is kind of the more, I would say, well, one of the more preserved forms of these West African diaspora religions that came generally from the Benin, Nigeria region of West Africa, and then the Mazatec tradition in Mexico, the Shipibo Conibo people in the Amazon. Um, Also before that, I had And this is again maybe a whole nother rabbit hole, but around the age of 13, I had a mentor come into my life who was somebody that went to school with my grandfather and still lived in the same neighborhood that I grew up in, who was half Japanese and who had spent much of his life in Japan. And he actually took me on as a private Japanese student. And so for almost, well, passed away a few years ago, but for about half of my life, he was my sensei, my mentor, and not just he saw that he was a very well read, and that's where I think I had that I had that guidance. That was a saving grace for me to a large extent. And who knows how life would have gone had I not had that. But he definitely represented, the kind of the wise grandfather, the sage, the philosopher figure. And he introduced me to in a very um in- digestible way, for a young man, Plato and the Platonic tradition and certain ways of thinking. He was also very much into the New Thought movement, like Ernest Holmes, and so the power of the mind, the science of mind, and kind of bridging that with ancient philosophy. So there's a few different areas there. Yeah, those are some of the main ones.
Cool. Well, I'm sure we'll come back to some of those. Maybe just to round things out a little bit, tell us and our listeners about the work that you're doing now, with Logos and in the um, coaching and consulting world.
Yeah, so Logos is kind of when I was approached about it, I was like, well, this is a dream project. I first met one of the founders of the parent company of Logos 2, 3 years ago, who I was in contact with because I was running some online study groups, and also through that, um, they were looking to do some translation work with a particular Arabic text, translating into Portuguese, and I supported in that process. And given my familiarity, or fluency in one case at least, Arabic is a lifelong journey, and I would not say in any sense that I'm fluent in the language, but enough that I can work with it. Um, so that was kind of how things started with Logos, and I would also go back to my teacher, my mentor, who really emphasized that our lineage is starts with Plato and Socrates, and he always said that to me. You and me, our lineage is Plato and starts with Plato and Socrates, and he included Jesus and Mary and Aristotle, of course. But he always emphasized that. So those groups that I was starting were initially Plato reading groups. We were just reading the dialogues together, and that attracted a small group of very interesting people. And then eventually some other things happened, through social media, and things kind of blew up for a period. It expanded, and we had a much larger group, and there was a focus on more like the Islamic philosophical tradition or spiritual tradition. And but for me, Plato was always the pillar. And so in a way, I think I can attribute my sensei, my mentor's induction into the Platonic tradition in his own way. I can attribute that to being the seed which resulted in how I got to become involved with Logos, and and then eventually, as time went on, and my own professional and career trajectory started lining up with what the needs were for Logos. It just sort of kind of organically evolved. I started once they decided that they wanted to expand into the U.S. because, to step back a little bit, the parent company of Logos is called Barca, and I won't. I forget what the exact translation would be into to English, but basically, it's a company that's like a cultural accelerator, and they focus on literature, on publishing. So in Brazil, currently I think there's about six different um, six different book clubs that focus on contemporary Brazilian literature, on law. On there's a Catholic one, there's a philosophy one. So Logos, I believe Logos was the first one in Brazil, and then they expanded, and then in December of last year, they wanted to launch logos in the US. And so I came on kind of as an in-house philosopher and just to talk about the texts and, kind of be the face. And then that grew into leading the operations and the expansion in the US. And it's look, and I don't want to say anything prematurely, but we are planning on releasing uh, a few more clubs in the US. The next one will be focusing on classical literature in general. So again, kind of going back to my origins, one of those texts. I think I already mentioned one of those texts, so it's an Easter egg, but I won't say what it's going to be.
So Logos's business, as it were, is organizing study groups around classical literature.
Not exactly. No. So it's a subscription club, let's say. So every month, subscribers receive a new text, um, and they won't know what the next month's text is until it's announced in the transition between the months. So far, it's been quite broad. We've done Aristotle's Nicomachean Ethics. We've done Boethius's Constellation of Philosophy. We've also done Hume. We've done Leibniz. This month is we just announced yesterday Thomas Hobbes' Leviathan. So it's a span. There's a large spectrum there of different time periods, different focuses, different traditions, and it's not limited to the Western tradition. There might maybe a time when we also bring in Eastern classics of philosophy. So in essence, it's a subscription club where you receive a philosophical text once a month. People can purchase the texts on their own, but that's sort of that's the essence of it. And so the club is the idea that you are reading in unison with a group of other people out there, and we are as we grow, because it's only been about 6 months or so that we've really been in business in the US. So we're still building the community side of things, but it is being rolled out, and people have the opportunity to connect with one another, to discuss the texts. An idea, the spirit of it is to help people re-engage with classics, and in a way that's, and I won't go too deep into this, but I could say a lot about my connecting Plato and the Phaedrus, and talking about literacy, but then also talking about people like Ivan Illich in the Vineyard of the Text, and sort of our relationship to the text throughout history. And this notion that what we're doing is not only are we republishing classics, but what we're doing is we're including the original languages, like Loeb would do, but then also the design of the book, the quality of the paper, and then also the covers are beautifully designed. It comes in a box. There's an accompanying booklet, a logos reader, and then generally it will include something like a poster or a bookmark. And so it bringing back this like experiential quality, like I mentioned, when I was a kid, I was attracted to this book on an illuminated text, illuminated manuscript of the Gospels, and so yes, you can go out and you can buy a few dollar used version of a Loeb or something in that vein, but also there's something about our collective tradition and how we relate to texts that I think in a way we're touching upon in presenting them in this way, that it's an experience. It's not just this transaction and the black and white and the mass market, paperback copies. It's like, we're putting a little bit more time and effort into thinking about how we do this and what accompanies it, what essays accompany it. We have a really incredible team of people that pretty much everybody on the team, regardless of where they work, has some background in philosophy or law or theology or whatever it may be. Like generally an educated group of people that have skin in the game, and are really thinking critically about this. It's not just we're not doing this just as a business to make money, but also there's a mission behind it that I kind of say poetically. It's like we're fanning the flames of philosophy's hearth, and getting people this curiosity reignited, to engage with classics.
Before I know Brian is cooking up some questions as we're going here. Maybe just before I hand it off to you, Brian. Josh, maybe you can tell us a little bit, because I think you and I are in a similar space in this way, about how you connect your interest in philosophy with the work that you do in organizations, and I think with businesses. Um, I, I find that a fascinating way of working.
Well, my favorite thing to talk about is the Maieutic method of Socrates. You know, he says there's multiple points, multiple passages throughout the Platonic corpus where he talks about the fact that his mother was a midwife and he practices the same art form. And but instead of helping women give birth to children, he helps, you know, in one case he says young men specifically, but you know, let's say just people in general give birth to the ideas that are pregnant in their souls, right? So he helps deliver. And I love to just think about, well, what does a midwife actually do in reality, you know, in the truly embodied sense, you know, the true vocation, the traditional vocation of the midwife. And I think that what really fascinates me about working in the realm of business and entrepreneurship, and you know, whether it's working with founders or you know with their teams or just individuals that maybe aren't, they're in a transition stage where maybe they're coming out of the corporate world and they're looking to start a new venture or something that feels more aligned with their values, is that you know, I can serve that maieutic function of not necessarily. Actually, I was just listening to something that came across my feed. It was Carl Rogers talking about advice. You know, he's like, everybody, you know, everybody's giving you advice. You know, your parents are giving you advice. I don't know, you're a lawyer. Everybody is trying to give you advice, right? But I think that the role of the philosopher, of the maieutic practitioner, is to be with, very much in that sort of Martin Buber, I thou kind of way, or as we alluded to in the beginning, right? Like dialogue, dialogos. What's that tertium quid that arises when we approach this common ground together in a really open way, without any predisposed, you know, judgments, or you know, sometimes we have to release even the goal orientation to be able to suss out, you know, like what's going on, you know, like how is this child positioned in the belly, you know, and like maybe we need to massage it a little bit so that it can come out more easily. We know what is the mother need, you know, does some tea maybe, or some sustenance, or you know, to be positioned in a different way. Like it's this constant engagement with like radical presence and life, to be able to in multiple different scenarios. It's like, well, one, what's really the idea? What really wants to come through? You know, and oftentimes people, the beliefs that they carry about who they are, about the way the world is, about the way that they see other people, really, in some ways, it can very much liberate them. But in some cases, also, uh, I really love the work of Pierre Grimes. He has thousands of hours of lectures on YouTube, and he's not very well known, but his content is incredible. And he wrote some books about this philosophical midwifery. And he talks about, you know, the logos and the pathologos, right? So the pathologos oftentimes is this. When we're very young and we're in there's a particular moment, you know, where we're very open and receptive, and somebody of authority around us, maybe a parent, maybe an uncle, maybe a teacher, um, happens to say something in a particular way that implants this seed kind of pathology within us, that develops this you know, this is, what would you call it, you know, like this dynamic that has to unfold over the course of our lives. It kind of becomes our struggle that we have to, this tribulation that we have to go through to kind of figure out, like, how do I integrate, how do I become more whole, how do I see more clearly, how do I discern truth more readily, and how do I know that for me, you know? And in the Platonic tradition, or it was at the Temple of Delphi, right? Gnothi seauton, right? Know thyself. And the same thing in the Arabic tradition. There's a saying, "Man arafa nafsahu faqad arafa rabbuhu." Whoever who knows themselves knows their Lord, right? So in this case, we can say, well, what is Lord? You know, I mean, what is that? You could delve into that. Maybe, you know, you could say this, whatever this thing is that you might relate to as Lord, is guidance, is clarity, is direction. And so I think that, there's a lot that I kind of spun out on, but I think when you bring it back to the business sense, it's how do we practice that radical presence in the mode of the philosophical midwife to help the individual um, give birth to what wants to come through them in a way that's healthy, so then they can look at it and they can see, like Socrates says, is it a true birth or is it a false birth? Is it a stillbirth? Right. So we can judge the idea as it comes through, and then iterate. Right. So we learn how to give birth in a clean way, but then reflecting that back, helping the individual see, well, what is it that's coming through, and how does that reflect back on my operating system and my beliefs. So a lot of it has to do with working with beliefs, working with cognitive frameworks, cognitive frames. I think we've talked about that, Boaz. Um, and then ultimately, what my favorite thing is helping people really. Another way of just talking about all of this is develop their potential. When I am so in love with people because everybody that I meet, I'm like, this person has something. They have something incredible to offer. And it's not the whole thing of my passion has to become my main source of income, or all of that has to become the same thing. But I do believe that everybody has a particular, like kind of like James Hillman's acorn theory. There's something inside everybody that wants to develop. And there's so many different types of intelligence. There's the analytical type of intelligence, the prefrontal cortex, kind of chopping up the world, and the reductive form. But there's also the right brain type of intelligence of feeling and sensing. Like I have one friend that's a filmmaker, a videographer, and the way that he was never really good in school, but the way that he can enter into a space and just he knows how to position things, he knows what to ask you. It's almost like he goes into a different state. And so that's also been like where, for example, my anthropological training and study of a lot of different traditions around the world, where trance is like at the core of the tradition. It's like how do we work with modification of conscious modification of states of mind or states of soul, even to be more receptive to this inspiration, right? Because creativity is the currency of the world. So an individual, so I guess I could say at the end, the value that I bring is that if I can help you get aligned with who you are, what your gift is, what you have to bring, and ultimately your creativity, I I have helped you essentially make yourself infinitely more valuable in the market, because now you're a player. You're not playing a role, but you're actually a source of this influx of fresh energy that can fuel the market essentially, and ideally improve the lives of other human beings.
Cool. Where do you want to take it, Brian?
I think he might have touched on just about all of our major themes and a few of the minor ones. Um, the the my first comment is to mention, in the spirit of full disclosure, is I saw an advertisement for Logos and the monthly book club idea, and I thought, oh, this is a good thing. This is a good thing, and so I reached out to try to connect with you guys because I just knew that, a number of the doctors that we've spoken to on our show, I said, I feel like we're brothers in arms, and like we're carrying the same banner in a certain sense. And so when I saw the logo stuff, I said, I think there's a pretty good chance these guys are carrying the same banner. And hearing your background, I think there's no way you couldn't be, because you've touched on the threads that we need to weave together. And so I was excited because philosophy, the classics, the human story of trying to unfold an understanding of the world is is fundamental to what it is to be human. And the influence of our world doesn't always point that out. I think of a line in Talking Heads where David Byrne says, "Don't you miss it? Don't you miss it? Some of you people all just about missed it." And so, I think well, now in particular, and I've said this before to other guests, and I've had some pushback on it, but I think that it is tricky to make sense of things nowadays. I do think that we're bombarded with lots of impressions in a way that we haven't been, you know, forever.
Mm,
And so that our cognitive load now it can be challenging. Um, and so I think that that sort of makes this banner of finding meaning even more critical,
mm,
which is a big whole ongoing story of philosophy since the Enlightenment, which we've drilled down on in a couple different episodes. But in the on the Socratic thread, there is this idea, uh, hode anaxistasos bios ubiotos anthropoi. This usually gets translated this is a famous saying from 2400 plus years ago by Socrates, our man Socrates, and it gets translated as the unexamined life is not worth living. And honestly, I don't think that's the best translation. What he's really kind of saying there, the anaxistasos is the unexamined part.
mm,
And what he really is saying is anaxistasos bios is the unexamined life. But the second part of that is ubiotos anthropoi, which is more like saying an unexamined life is not worthy of a human. That there is something fundamental about our humanity that is not fulfilled if we lead an unexamined life, which to me is like way different. When we just say that, well, the unexamined life is not worth living, a person can easily and somewhat glibly say, well, I enjoy, my life. I like Friday nights and, I have fun on the weekends and I enjoy a good meal. And so if there's something that I'm missing out, it's okay. I'm feeling pretty good about things. And that's how you miss it. Because what Socrates is saying, and at some point I want to go into Socrates because not necessarily today, but what a trip, right? Uh, what he's really saying is that, and the Buddhists say a very similar thing, that it's a very special thing to be a human being. And Terence McKenna gave a lecture in Santa Fe, and he said basically the same thing. There's a lot of evidence that human life is really special and precious, too precious for you to screw it up with your Volvos and your Cuisinarts. That was the Terence McKenna quote. I got nothing against Volvos. I got nothing against Cuisinarts. They all have their place in the web, right? But the point is, exestasos bios, the examined life. That's the baby that we're trying to give birth to. And that is, by my way of thinking, that's the role that philosophy, and I think that Plato would agree, that's the role that philosophy wants to serve to us, is how do we get to that unexamined life? And, to say, well, the examined life, okay, go examine your life, that kind of, we don't really necessarily know what to do with that, where to go with that. And that's where philosophers come to help us. because there's a lot of elements to examining life. You know, there's all the stuff going on inside me, there's all the stuff outside of me, there's the relationship between the two. There's what do I think, there's what do I do, there's what's the relationship between what do I think and what do I do. And then there's everything everybody's telling me all the time, giving me advice, as you say. Right. And so I think this is one of the things, as one of my teachers said. He said, no matter what goes on in your life, at some point, if you've touched some beautiful philosophy, you at least have that like a touchstone, you know? And uh, my feeling is that it's the only game in town.
Mm,
And that, and I've said this before, everything that I do is an expression of my philosophy, is the value that I hold. Whether you see some of it around the building that I'm sitting in is also an expression of that, right? Um, how we do what we do. That's why I'm always one of my one string banjo songs is phronesis, right?
mm,
From Aristotle, which is what do we do? You know, famous story with Socrates, it seems appropriate. He's walking in one of the narrow alleys in Athens, and coming the other way is a young, smart, bright guy whose name was Xenophon. And he blocks the way so that Xenophon can't get by. And then he starts asking him somewhat jokingly where to get various items in the town. Like, where do you get good groceries? Where do you get good fish? Where do you get? And Xenophon politely, tells him. And then he says, and where do you go to learn to be just and to be noble?
mm,
And Xenophon didn't have any answers for him. And then Socrates said to him, we are told by Xenophon later, follow me and learn. Right. So that's how they met. And we know about Socrates from a few different places, and Xenophon is one of them. Turns out to be a very dramatic story. And but anyway, that's for later, a different place, different time. But I think that that's what we're really talking about is how do we make a life that is just and that's noble? And how do we stand on the shoulders of those that have gone before us? I like to refer to our antepasados, right? They passed before us. They're a herencia, right? They're a heritage that we have as a foundation. And I'm a great fan of subjectivity. I know it's not in vogue lately, but um, so anyway, I'm very excited about the logos process because, and I had said before that I think of these things as critical basically on three categories of things. And if we take them in order, the first one I consider the category of push-ups. That we don't just waltz out the door and become philosophers. We actually have to do some process. And you touched on it. You had an impulse for it as a youngster, as did I, and that is the mystery of language. That everything goes on with language. And you, I think, probably understand because you are multilingual. Am I right?
yes.
So would you say that there's almost a different you? When I'm in South America and I'm speaking Spanish, I really feel like it's a slightly different me than English me in the United States. And I think it's because there's the cognitive model and all the handles have changed. And so I'm kind of in a different world. And so, of course, I'm kind of a different person. I don't know if you have that, if you have a version of that. But what I'm pointing at is how fundamental language is in the reality that we experience. Do you have an experience of that?
Well, I think the word that comes to mind, which is very relevant to my anthropological training, is the word liminal. And what putting oneself in a different environment or using a different language can do is it can foster that phenomenological sense of liminality, the subjective experience of the not just being liminal. I mean, liminality can happen at any time. Arguably, we're always in this liminal state, and to be aware of I think that's what it does. Is it's an externalized activity. Again, language is it's vibration, right? You're producing sound, or if you're traveling to a different place, right? There's some sort of external activity that's taking place that is allowing you to become more aware of the liminality of human existence. And I think that there are, in rare cases, there are people that are truly bilingual, that they can operate at a near native level in multiple languages. And I can't say that I am one of those people. I think I speak very proficiently. I speak I speak almost more Portuguese than I speak English these days. So I'm very proficient in Portuguese, and I believe Spanish as well, and then Arabic. Is like I said, a lifelong journey. But that is a question that I've had before, and I don't really know, but I do think that it induces that awareness of liminality, and the power of language. And but it also brings to mind this. I was just reviewing, actually, one of the first Logos Talks. So we also have a podcast that we're starting to do that I'm hosting called Logos Talks, and one of the first guests we had was Michael Pakaluk, who is one of the, if not the world's leading expert, one of the world's leading experts in Aristotle. And I was just reviewing some of the footage from that, and he highlighted the difference between love and friendship in English, right? There's no etymological connection between those two words in our language, the way that we use language, in this modern context. And however, he was using the example of Spanish or Portuguese. He says, I would imagine that in Portuguese, it's like Spanish. Amor and amistad in Spanish come from a similar root,
Same
right?
root.
Similarly in Portuguese, right? So, he was talking about philia, and just a little bit about that topic, philia and agape, and these different types of love, and how Aristotle really emphasizes the importance of friendship and fellowship along the path, right, towards virtue, towards true humanity. So I thought that is interesting, because that's very central. I mean, Socrates in the Cratylus, the Cratylus is all about language and etymology. And I think that etymologically, I've written things at times where I kind of touch upon this, like the pharmacology almost of etymology, or this the practice, the medical practice of etymology. Because simply when one starts reflecting on one's own language, one's native language, and looking at the roots, even a language like Arabic, for example, it's a rhizomatic, it's an arborescent, mycelial kind of language, because it's all about roots, and everything is built on roots. And you can trace it's so, there are very few lone. I mean, Arabic is incredibly rich language because of this structure. And so oftentimes, I think that some of the value that I've added at certain tables or in certain Zoom meetings, where from the outsider's perspective looking in, I look at the Arabic language with this kind of philosophical, etymological lens, and I notice similarities in certain words. Or I notice I'm always looking at, because it helps me learn the language as well. I'm looking at the etymology of different words, and I notice certain things, and I'm like, have you ever, to a native Arabic speaker, for example, like, have you ever like realized this or considered this? And like, actually, no. Like, the language is a convention for me. I use it, and it's sort of unconscious. But when I make it conscious, and I do that examination simply of the sound vibration that I'm producing on a daily basis, like, all of a sudden, my language or my relationship, for example, there's a lot of people that they grew up in a religious environment. They kind of become secular and agnostic in their adult lives, but then they eventually they come back to the tradition, because they're seeking that deeper sense of meaning in life. They're looking for that individuation, or that experience of truer, deeper humanity. There's that beauty is pulling them, maybe we could say. And all of a sudden they start looking at, I mean, one very simple example is the 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 main name for God. Allah in Arabic just means the God. So, obviously, there's many different interpretations of, and kind of nuances on how you can look at that word. But the predominant name given is Rahman, and Rahman comes from the word Raham, which means womb. And so the two names in the first surah of the Quran, and everything starts with the Bismillah. Bismillah, in the name of God. Ar-Rahman, Ar-Rahim. These are two words that come from the same root, Raham, which is womb. And people don't, maybe people don't think about that. Now it's becoming, I see it more on social media. People are talking about this kind of stuff, but simply that, it radically could change somebody's relationship to their tradition. So just to, kind of,
And that gets translated as mercy. Is that right? El-Rahman?
yes, it's translated as the merciful or the beneficent, but generally, I believe that the consensus amongst scholars is that really the way you can define it is Rahman is all encompassing mercy for
Okay.
every iota of existence, and then Rahim is specific mercy or beneficence, or grace, for the
Right,
individual.
right,
So it's like it's the
right,
one and the many in a sense, right? So
right.
that's the
So to just point out the significance of what you're saying, that, I think we came upon this, when we were talking about Heidegger, because within Heidegger, he uses German words that are cognates within German, but within English, they're not at all. And people might listen to that and say, okay, well, of course, what difference does that make? But when we start to understand cognitive models, they aren't just made up of things and the qualities of those things, but a lot of the critical information has to do with relationships between things. And so within languages, cognates actually carry insights of the culture that generated the language. And language isn't just conventional. Language evolves and morphs, and it's a mapping of a cultural experience that's bigger than any one person's experience. And the significance of that in our examined life is that it's the model that we use internally to understand this new piece of experience that comes into our world. So the richer a model we have that maps more relations and more distal relations, it's as if we carry more meaning within ourselves that we can resonate out of our experience, if you will. Gadamer, a student of Heidegger, talks about our spiritual, uh, he calls it like a resonance chamber,
Mm,
and that's something that we bring with us before we have a new experience. That's like a guideline that helps us resonate meaning out of the things that happen to us. And so this dovetails into when we talk about language, we say, well, are you fluent or not? Which typically means, uh, can you get to the bus station? Can you find a bathroom? Can you understand what the average person says to you? For the purpose of the examined life, though, that's not fluent enough in our
mhm,
own first native language. Th And that's what also philosophy provides to us. That's why I like the books that are in public domain means they're over 100 years old, which means that there's no way they're not stretching our language map. We aren't just whatever they're telling us. Part of the push-ups that they're doing for us, because this is still in that push-ups category, is they're building out our language model in ways that our conversations just going around in daily life, they just won't do. No matter how astute your colleagues are, there's probably stuff in Spinoza that's gonna hit you a little differently than stuff on your last Zoom call. There's ways that Plato is gonna stretch language for you or point out relations that will be different. So so in that sense, the onboarding the classics is dimensionalizing everything that happens in your life from that point forward. And that's part of it. The other part that I think is underrated and is extremely unvogue now, I'm doing a public domain reading on the channel of John Dewey's book, The Quest for Certainty,
Hmm.
which is really interesting, but it's also a little dense. It's not Heidegger, it's not Hegel, but there's a push-ups function just in paying attention. People pay a lot of money to go to meditation retreats and things like that, and it turns out that actually the muscle of your mind is stretched and empowered just by the attention challenge that reading some of this stuff, and and people see it as, oh, this is this great hurdle I don't want to go through. No, 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 exactly wrong, exactly the opposite. Plus, now you've got AI, you've got Google. You don't need to crack a dusty old book to find out what that word meant.
Yeah.
It'll tell you.
Yeah.
So those are my two categories in the push-ups. Uh,
I love that. It reminds me of Boethius's Constellation of Philosophy. When Lady Philosophy appears to him, and here's a man who went from the heights of his society, the absolute pinnacle of his society, to the absolute bottom. Being in a jail cell. It was similar to Socrates. Waiting to be executed in a very horrific manner. And Lady Philosophy appears to him, and her dress is torn and tattered because everybody's been groping at it, over the centuries, and they grab a piece of the dress and they think they have the whole thing. And on her dress is this ladder, and at the bottom is the Greek letter. What is it? P in Greek.
tau.
Theta is, what is it? Pau.
Oh, theta. Well,
Yeah.
there's
Well,
tau and there's theta. Yeah.
Tau and theta, right? So praktike and theoria at the top. So the path of philosophy starts in practice and ends in theoria, which you can say maybe is like the witnessing. Maybe the witnessing of the light of the one or something. So it reminds me a lot of that, and then also, of course, the Platonic sort of pedagogical model of like, okay, well, let's start with the gymnasium and music, right? Let's learn, about how to use your physical instrument and how to like think in proportion, think kind of like mathematically, intuitively. And so I think like this whole notion of also, a part of my life that I didn't touch on earlier is that I lived in a Theravada Thai forest monastery, a couple of them actually, for a period of about 6 months in my life. And
Nice.
what I learned a lot of things in that environment. But one is that this whole thing about sitting meditation is this is not really, this is practice, but it's not like the only way to meditate. Over there, a lot of the monks would predominantly do walking meditation. And so there's this idea that you know like praying at all, like from the gospel, maybe like praying at all times or whatever. That I forget exactly how the verse goes, but oh yeah, what is it? Ceaselessly pray or something is this regard. I forget exactly how it's phrased, but it's this notion that like no matter what you're doing, and I think also very much it's like kind of the Sufi notion of the guild, that you have a craft, you have a vocation that you do, and maybe you make shoes or you make hats or you're a coder or whatever it is, but that also is that praktike, that exercise that we're talking about, and so reading as well, just the act of being attentive to the text and really engaging with the text. um and I think that also this act, again, bringing it back to community, like the reading groups that you're maybe doing, the opportunity to speak the text out loud. Ivan Illich, in that text that I mentioned, in the vineyard of the text, he emphasizes this point, that at one point in the history of at least the West, it was kind of unthinkable to read in silently in one's head. You read aloud. It was this completely, fully embodied activity that you did. Um, and so, to be able to, this is what we did in the Plato groups I also facilitated a few years back, is we would take sections of the text and we'd read it in community. And when you read it and you can hear it, it's a completely different experience. And you start realizing like, wait a minute, this is kind of more like a theater piece in a way. Like this is a play that's being put on, and you have to enact it to really understand like, oh, wait a minute, there's this is humorous. Like Plato's a comedian in a sense. He masters, at the end of the symposium, he talks about, he positions Socrates as saying, like, oh, the real mastery is when you can do both comedy and tragedy at the same time. Like if you can combine both of those things, and it's almost like he's kind of giving himself a pat on the back because he kind of does that in a way in his works. And so, just to say like, I think that anything can be that exercise, that practice, especially the reading. And I think that not it's not novel, just like kind of reviving, blowing on the embers again of this very ancient practice of being embodied readers, if that kind of makes sense.
Mhm, mhm. Well, and I think that I certainly got to a point where it's effortless pretty much. And it's taken me a while to sort of realize that that's not as common nowadays as it was when I was young. Uh, but that also the change of the media, and I'm a big Marshall McLuhan fan, and this idea that the medium is the message. And so, like, when you were talking about the presentation of the book, right? And this is a whole, like, I don't know if you're familiar with McLuhan, but he's got a book about the Gutenberg galaxy and the revolutionary change that the printing press was, and
Mm,
kind of the before and after, which we don't really even can't even imagine. But a
yeah,
book was a treasure.
yeah,
I mean, it was a treasure because it was hand produced. And I can remember as a young person, that's how old I am. I can remember getting books, and it still happens to me. I'll be honest. I get a book, and there's a kind of a thrill. There's a kind of a Christmas morning thing that goes on with me with that. And only part of it is the physical impression of the book, but a really nice book, it sets you up correctly for the experience. And that's one of the things that I saw from Logos production. And folks know I'm not an advertising guy, right? Like we don't do that. So what I'm saying is exactly what I think, like it or not. Right? But what I saw was it seemed like you were generating a certain amount of respect for the text. That that is a respect for the process that the text represents, which is this dimension of humanity that I think is very special and might be our saving grace in a literal sense, which is to say, the march of our understanding. Um, the second of the three things for me, I think of as payload. And to really understand the value of the payload in the classics and the philosophy is to understand what sometimes gets called the great conversation, which is why we're referring to Plato and Socrates, which we're talking 400 BC. Uh, because a lot of these topics are so timeless that the thoughts that they had in 400 BC are not irrelevant. And in some cases, when I was young, there was this character named Mortimer J. Adler. I don't know
yeah.
if you're familiar with him,
Oh yeah, I've
but
got he's right here.
he, yeah, he used to claim to be the highest paid philosopher in the world. And Uncle Morty would show up at St. John's every year to give a lecture. And every year, the senior class would prank him. Like the year that I was there, it was in the auditorium, which had the slanted floor, and I think they let go a bunch of marbles or ping pong balls, so they pachinko machined their way down the auditorium. In another year, they had a phone behind the podium, and in the middle of his talk, the phone rang, and he picked it up, and I think it was Scott Buchanan on the phone or Stringfellow Bar or one of these St. John's, icons. And but I bring him up because I think he said, and I don't ever remember hearing of him reneging on this, that he thought that all of modern philosophy amounted to no more than footnotes on a copy of Aristotle. which I found very insulting because there's this rich world of philosophy. And and yet now that I'm old enough to where I finally can hold some of these things in the same brain. Because when you're young, you read Plato and you put that down, you read Aristotle, you put that down, you read Aquinas, you put that down, but to put it all together and to hold it all in one is a product of age and breadth, length of fingertips palming the basketball. And so now that I'm at that age, I find myself coming back to Aristotle with a ridiculous consistency. Like, embarrassingly, I find that at least he's the place to start. He might not be the final word, but boy, in so many things is he the place to start, And
Mm.
if you've had a conversation with an expert on Aristotle, you've probably gotten that sense of l
That reminds me
laying a
too,
bedrock for
uh,
understanding.
Joshua, when we met prior, you made a comment about shamanism also underlying philosophy, and you talked a little bit about the kind of connections you saw between shamanism, Plato, Aristotle. So maybe that's something to weave in here too.
Well, we're on the exact same frequency because that's literally where I was gonna go with this. And so, talking about so let me just preface it with this, right? There is a pretty perennial theme within the wisdom traditions of the world of this, which I would say, again, I don't like to put things into dichotomies, but for the sake of the conversation, let's juxtapose, right? The kind of like relativistic, reductionistic, materialistic type of I don't know, identity politics type of thing. It finds its expression in this sort of way and in our current age. So that particular way of operating and seeing the world, right, which is ultimately fairly nihilistic. But then you have the alternative one, which maybe you could say characterize as the classical tradition, right? And at the center of that, I think in most cases, if not all cases, is this notion of formation, of becoming a true person, right? And that's not the potential for that is accessible to every single human being on the planet. That's our inheritance as humans. But to develop that potential is something that requires volition and ideally community and ideally history, and culture and all of these things. And that's arguably what all those things exist to do, is to form the individual. And so, rites of passage, religious traditions, wisdom traditions, et cetera, et cetera. And I think that what again, when I'm coming back to having had that conversation with Michael Pakaluk, is that what he was emphasizing at one point is that, um, in book 10 of the Nicomachean Ethics, what a lot of people don't really get, at least, of course, he has. Uh, I might be butchering this, and I don't talk to every a lot of different people who have read the Nicomachean Ethics, but it's basically about theosis at the end. It's about divinization. It's about becoming as godlike as possible. And that is the summum bonum of kind of the human journey, and that's sort of like the linear aspect of, if you want to look at it in that sense of the human development trajectory, is that it is, well, why do you become more virtuous? Why do you become, or is the virtue kind of a symptom of this journey, this like almost alchemical journey of maybe in the Jungian sense you would say individuation, or becoming in the Christian sense maybe becoming more Christ-like, becoming more aligned with the indwelling logos. But this is kind of a universal theme. I mean, in like the hermetically influenced traditions, they talk about like the perfected nature, or in the Islamic tradition or the Sufi tradition, you would say the insan el kamil, which means the complete or the perfected human being. And there are examples or exemplars. So in a lot of these traditions, it's like the Eastern Orthodox tradition with the elders, or the sheikh in the Arabic Islamic Sufi tradition, or the guru, or whatever it is. There's this perennial theme of the wise elder, right? The Socrates or whoever it is that can help facilitate for that process. there are rites of passage, there are all these things that are ultimately all pointed at this center, which is the transformation of that raw material into the refined, scraping the dross off as you heat the gold, or chipping away at the the statue, the David statue, whatever it is, however you want to conceptualize it. Um, and I think that that's kind of like, so really it comes down to when you realize, okay, tradition important, um books, history, past, important, right? The how, I think, is very interesting for a lot of people. That's a huge part of the journey. Is like, well, oh my gosh, okay, great. I know this is important, but now I have access to the whole planet's compendium, of everything imaginable. I could become, a Taoist. I could follow the Platonic, Neoplatonic tradition, or what kind of Neoplatonic tradition? The Iamblician, theurgical Neoplatonic tradition, or the Plotinus, Plotinus kind of, radical transcendence, or I don't know, But then, you're mentioning this whole idea of like, okay, footnotes to Aristotle. Well, Whitehead said footnotes to Plato, right? Well, Peter Kingsley said that Plato is just footnotes to the pre-Socratics, to all those that came before him, Pythagoras and Empedocles. Um, and so I think that Parmenides, and it's so interesting because that's kind of where I find the the threshold for me is like, well, because I mentioned it, and maybe this is just my personal interest, but I do think it all kind of s- finds there's a confluence here, because when we talk about language, even, um, and the production of language, and when you think about some of these guys that, Peter Kingsley talks about this ancient practice of incubation, where philosophers, and the philosopher was also at, in the pre-Socratic time, at least in this particular version of how he looks at things, they were shamans, essentially. They were healers. They were oracles. They were priests. So, in the case of, I think it was Parmenides, who was a priest of Apollo. And in these temples to Persephone, Apollo, there was always a cave. Either they were built on top of a cave or near a cave, or they constructed an artificial cave. Again, womb imagery, right? The void, the unconscious, the underworld. And what they would do is they would go and they would just basically lay down in these caves for days on end, and they would go into these deep states of meditation, of liminality, and they would come out having had some sort of shamanic experience or interaction with this, a deity or an archetypal figure. And or they would come out and they would have, there's, I think it was stories of Parmenides who would come out of the cave, and, like, at one point, like, healed the whole village of some plague or something. And so, it's like, and then even with language, there's some things he talks about in his texts, Peter Kingsley, about the production of language, and like mantric repetition of language. And I think that there are, I think that's the threshold that I find really fascinating, is like, well, what is language when it's not purely transactional or acquisitive, or like we're just using it to exchange something, but like on the horizontal plane, but maybe like the employment of language in a different register on like a vertical plane, right? Like, what is that? And then also the fact that, like, if you've heard of the guy, the Indian mathematician Ramanujan, they made a movie about him, the man who knew infinity, or the man who knew eternity, I think is the name of the movie. And he says in the movie, when he's invited to England, uh, somebody, who was it that was questioning him? I forget the name of the very famous mathematician, but basically Ramanujan goes, when he's questioned about, well, how did you figure this stuff out? He goes, my God, my deity puts the answers to the equations on my tongue, and reveals things to me in dreams. And this has been the case for so many people throughout the course of history, that invented things that radically changed the course of human civilization. And so I think that there's something powerful there, and I think it very much so. It's in Plato as well. It's hidden, but there's something about this how empty can you get? You know, to be receptive. And Socrates even talks about it. He talks about his daemon, you know, who never really told him what to do, but told him what not to do. You know, and the theme of the daemon, the theme of the guide. You know, I think that this is all super fascinating. And so I don't know, you know, where you know you might want to pick up on that, either of you, but I think that's what we touched upon a bit, Boaz, in our conversation prior to this.
Well, and you know, one of my one-string banjo songs is about dispositional knowledge as opposed to propositional knowledge. Propositional knowledge is I sit in basically the same state and I change the content. I run the same basic program through the same basic hardware, but I'm running a different proposition.
Hmm.
Dispositional knowledge is now I'm in a different state. And, you know, Chuang Tzu's wheelwright is usually the guy that I use as the example of that. But, you know, Kung Fu is a good example of that. It's a skill, it's a disposition that you bring to a situation. And we were talking the other day about the first chapter of the Tao Te Ching, where he clearly is pointing towards a dispositional shift that he refers to as with desire or without desire, is the way it usually gets translated. Um, this all moves to the third point that I have. The first was push ups, the second was payload. And most people stop at payload, honestly. Okay, now I've read Kant. So now I know what Kant says. And that's the package. That was what the value proposition was. Now I've read Kant. Now I have Kant in here somewhere with the idea that that's kind of where it stops. My third category is raw material. And that is that all of this stuff feeds a process. When we talk about examined life, there's something that's implied that feels very passive about that. But I think that when we get into it, we find out that it's in fact not very passive. It's something actually active about it. You're not, you know, and this maybe gets to some of the early phenomenologists. We move out into the world. We're not just a passive going, where everything just flows into us. And that's part of where our discursive knowledge, or what the Buddhists might call our discriminating wisdom, starts to generate the experience that we have as this raw matter for experience. But so this idea of raw material means that I'm doing a process that this raw material is feeding. I am a furnace, and this raw material is the coal I'm throwing in it to keep the fire burning. And that is that individuation that you're talking about, or that unfolding, or answering the question, who am I? Is the way Ramakrishna put it. But I think that that is the real clever thing about this, is that that's what you're doing already. You're just probably doing it in a somewhat less conscious way that feels just like scratching itches or rolling over in bed at night, because you just kind of feel like maybe you ought to. Uh,
Well, there's a tiger dragon thing there, Brian, that we've talked about some, that it might be the case that whatever you're doing, your raw materials, right, your lived experience, direct experience, um, can be um, made more meaningful just by being made more conscious. But there's also something to there being some variety of experience, which might be different for each individual, but that we've categorized generically into tiger and dragon, where there's some experience that's about the mind, and some experience that's about the body. And I know that that's a not precise mapping of tiger and dragon, but I've been thinking about that a lot lately. You know, this last weekend I was up at the land in New Mexico working on some projects with Isaac, and I hadn't I've been living in the city for the last year and a half, and I was aware of the difference in physicality between those lifestyles and the implications of that on the quality of experience that I have. Um, so yeah, curious, um, Josh, what you think about that too.
I'd like to understand a little bit better, what you mean by tiger and dragon.
Do you want to define that better than I did, Brian? I just kind of referred generically to dragon being more about mind orientation and tiger being more about being hands on. But I'm sure Brian can do a better job.
I mean, that's kind of where we came upon it. There's an often repeated image in Chinese art of a tiger and a dragon fighting. And usually the tiger's on the bottom looking up over his shoulder, and the dragon is and there's usually 4 characters with it. Tiger, dragon makes luck. And the idea is that they sort of represent different realms of mastery that a person might have one tendency. Like, for example, before I started studying martial arts, I was a pudgy little kid with glasses. And it was the last thing in the world that one would have assumed that I would do. But to me, it seemed like brains over brawn. And I was in a position that could use some brawn on my side of things. And so so that I was tended I can still remember my teacher, me fighting with somebody who was just handed me my ass, basically, and my teacher laughing and going, "Oh, look, Mr. Bryan, he wants to talk about it." Because I was more in the mental realm. And so for me, I think it was really important, and it was really balancing and embodying for me to get forced into it, even if it meant taking some beating about the head and shoulders on more than one occasion. So my teacher, on the other hand, had been through Vietnam at 2 tours of duty as a, Green Beret. And he came to me once and he said, "Oh, I've been reading this book and I can't put it down." And I was like, "Wait a minute, reading a book?" Right? And then he shows me this book, and it's a paperback copy of uh, the atlas, the world atlas. And he says, "Look, everywhere that's blue is somewhere I can go on my sailboat." So, and he was purely tiger. He was in the material realm, and he doesn't think twice, but never 3 times. And, very hands-on, very pragmatic, but he was thrown towards the tiger dimension. I was thrown towards the dragon. And then as a teacher, I would see both come in. And, we say soft students need to be hardened, hard students need to be softened. And so there's this idea that we develop ourselves towards balance, which is a very Aristotelian idea, right? This idea of balance, the mean, right? Don't be
Mhm.
foolhardy, don't be a coward, find that sweet spot. And which is that idea that we as philosophers we have to cultivate ourselves. And to cultivate ourselves, part of that is filling in our weaknesses. But we can't fill in a weakness if we're not aware of the weakness. And that's where examination comes in. Examination will show us our weaknesses as well as our strengths, as well as, a bunch of other things. But so I think what you were referencing to was this idea that we want our experience base to broaden us. And I've made this argument before that there's an architectural argument that to attain heights, I have more stability if I have a broader base. Um, and which again, I think, for Aristotle, there was that idea of the phronimo, who was the exemplar. His idea was that we don't just do this. We don't just hold it as an idea, as a value, and then go about our business. We actually need to learn it. And so we need to learn what we're not doing right. We need to learn how to do things that maybe are difficult for us. And we usually need somebody there to urge us on. But like Schopenhauer says, the great teachers of history who left us these classics are teachers that can do that.
Mhm.
He says we need a shock. And that's what some of these classics correctly understood. If you've gone through the push-ups to get through the language, and you've got the attention span, and you successfully get that bridge, you will have a broadened map. You will gain capacities and dimensions of your understanding that just were dormant and would have remained so. I mean, that's the
Mhm.
final. How do we squeeze all the juice out? How do we get every cherry out of the pie? How do we fulfill that, famous Aristotle word, entelechy,
Mhm.
what it is to be human? How do we lead that life, what Aristotle usually gets translated as the good life? Uh, I think it's eudaimonia, again, that daimon word, right? Um, how do we get there? How do we act in a way? uh, which is why I found Dewey and his study of the relation between knowledge and action to be so relevant. And it's very relevant today. If you want to understand the modern world, you need to understand the Enlightenment. If you want to understand the problems of the modern world, you need to understand the philosophical challenges presented by the Enlightenment.
Mhm.
And to understand those, I don't think we really can genuinely understand those if we don't understand our thinking and the way in which our thinking contributed to the problem. And
Yes.
we look at Hegel kind of rebounding our way off of one gutter to the other down the bowling lane, uh, as we go from too idealistic and romantic to too materialistic and reductionist and back to we kind of zigzag across that sweet spot.
Mhm.
Um,
Yeah, the mean.
so
Yeah,
the
there's a
mean.
lot. Yeah, there's a lot that comes to mind there. I think, how can one affect change, essentially? I resonate with you, I and commiserate to a certain extent, of having been somewhat of a disembodied young person at certain points in life. Well, I was also very interested in things like qigong and kung fu, and I did aikido and what else? I was very interested in these sort of more contemplative forms of martial art, or more. I don't know what you would say. Like, Aikido means the way of loving energy, kind of. So, something that's not explicitly, it's not just about, hurting your opponent, or anything. It's about really moving energy and understanding how to work with push and pull, and a stillness and motion, activity and passivity. And I always found, that to be intuitively valuable. Um, and over the years, I also have realized, oh, well, some of the medicine that I need is to get more embodied, even in the sense of, like, okay, yeah, it's probably not good for me to um, I don't know, participate in anything that would be considered, a vice, like smoking or drinking, or I don't know, like doing things that maybe were reckless at certain points in my life, especially as, a teenager. And at the same time, it was this weird juxtaposition where I had this mentor as a young person who was like, inducting me into this, like, wisdom tradition, and it felt very special and very private and sacred in a sense. While at the same time, I'm out there racing my car, with other kids from my high school, and consuming lots of alcohol, and just being really kind of a delinquent in many ways. And and so there was this in Japanese, there's these two words, honne and tatemae, which means like your true self, and then the mask that you wear. And the Japanese are uh very proficient at using those two things, or distinguishing those two things. It's completely a what we might call, I don't know, a high context society, a veiled society in many senses. And and so I think that I found that, oh my gosh, like, I am so weird, and I can't connect with anybody around me on the things that I'm actually interested in. So I might as well just become a delinquent, and at least I can connect with people, you know? And I think that, obviously that changed radically over the years. And at times I've been I have a tendency to be a little uptight about how I conduct myself, and how I live, and how consumptive I am, or how much I indulge, in things that are beyond the bare minimum that I need to live kind of like a monastic lifestyle. But that there's a medicine also for me at least, because of maybe I'm you know I'm haven't been in that mean point for much, many seasons of life, and so at times I have to step over and, like, take a little bit from the indulgent side to bring that more ascetic side back into balance. So, but then similarly, like, there was a point in my life where I thought about pursuing the academic path, and I started doing it, and I started getting all these signs, that I was just kind of like, internally and externally, where I felt, yeah, I don't know if this is the path, or at least it's not the right time for this path. I gotta get out in the world, and I gotta experience things, and I gotta learn how to use my instrument. And a part of the instrument, beyond the body, is also the personality. Like, how does one develop a personality? And you can only develop a personality and character by that friction of being in contact and rubbing up against people and having conflict and having disagreements and finding things that you love and that you enjoy. And you have to really explore, and I think that's one thing that I appreciate, because it keeps on coming back to mind, is within, like, the Islamic Sufi tradition. It was always encouraged that one would travel, that one go and seek knowledge. This is in the Quran. This is one of the few prayers in the Quran. It says, "God, please add unto me knowledge," and the word for knowledge also means sign in Arabic. So, kind of in the, what, maybe Peircean sense, like the sign symbol, like that kind of sign. So, and that the world, so you're kind of going and you're experiencing and you're witnessing these signs, and it's doing that to you. And also, what's interesting is the word in Arabic for word, kilma, also, the etymology of it has to do with wounding. So it's like, as you acquire more language, it's like the rite of passage. In some traditions of rite of passage, like, there would be a ritual wound inflicted upon the individual. Or in the West African tradition that I studied, at one point in the induction process into the community, an individual might be scarred. A little bit of their skin would be opened, and, like, some herb or something would be put in there to signify this infusing, this transition. And so I think that, it's a perennial theme that I've witnessed and experienced personally, that intersection of action and contemplation. And then ultimately, the kind of I think we alluded to, maybe, Alan Watts, or was it, we spoke about Alan Watts earlier, or was it Terence McKenna? But, this note, I think Alan Watts really talks a lot about, like, the Tao, right? And that's the thing, is like, how can you, you know, act without acting? And this is sort of that's the sweet spot to get to, and that's what everybody's pointing to. That's what Aristotle's pointing to. That's what, the Tao is. That's what, even maybe you could say, being in the world but not of the world, in the Christian sense. Um, and so, what I'm very much interested, because I'm interested in action. I mean, with that foundation of contemplation, of awareness, right? Of having cultivated a lot of and accumulated a lot of knowledge that has done that purification and can serve as the raw material. But then, what do we do? Like, what do we do? Understanding how we got where we got, and then also recognizing the fact that, well, there are people out there that have done none of the literary, have not gone on a literary or historical journey, but they intuitively sense, like, where we need to go, uh, at this point in time. Whether it's, like, movements that are about getting into, back into nature, or having, or detoxing from technology, or whatever the case may be. There are people out there that they don't understand how we got where we are, but they get intuitively where we need to go, where we need to get back to, in a sense, for that middle. And I think that that's where the work lies. You have people like, there was the Highlander Institute in Tennessee. You have John Senior's program, the folk school movement in the Nordic countries of Grundtvig. There have been individuals that have really understood that there's a formula, and that formula is more or less, universal in its structure, in its form, not necessarily in the content, but that there are things that we can. I think St. John's probably is a good example of that. I think that they do the Socratic style education, but then also I believe that the campus is right on a beautiful piece of land, and they encourage the students to engage with the land and be outside and
Mhm,
be in community. And
mhm,
so there are pockets out there of institutions or communities that are finding like this sweet spot, you know, to
mhm,
create the conditions to cultivate individuals that have that balanced approach. Or what was it you said, the dispositional, they're cultivating their disposition, which which I think is, to me it's like that's where we should be focusing our efforts, right? How do we create the conditions for those sorts of environments to arise?
Right. The Buddhists have this idea of a mind oriented towards enlightenment. And, I think that there are certain formulaic parts to it, but I think there are also certain karmic parts to it also. And maybe that's part of a dispositional evolution. The listening that one has and the price we have to pay, and because everybody's got a unique circumstance, and yet we're all kind of grappling with the same ultimate reality. That's what I call one elephant theory.
Mhm.
Still just one elephant, no matter how many different ways. And it seems like you kind of in that idea. Gee, why is the Lao Tzu saying the same stuff Ibn al-Arabi is saying the same stuff that Aquinas said after he had a major dispositional shift, not so much before, but after.
Yeah.
Uh, there, but you and I are a rare breed because the the folks that want to see one elephant are actually kind of rare. Uh, we're very much in a time of my God, not your God. Even though if we think about it, we know there's no God but God. Right? How can there be? How can there be? But and this is a distinction that I always come back to. It's another one of my one string banjo songs. And that is that in Japan, I sat with Joshu Sasaki Roshi when I was young. When I left St. John's, I went into the Zen Center. And within Japanese Buddhism, our regular listeners will know what I'm going to say. There's two traditions, Jiriki and Tariki. One means myself and power, the other means trusting others. And philosophy, you can put it to work for either. If it's trusting others, then maybe you can just get to the payload stage and you can find a payload that feels good and you can put all your chips in that basket. But if you're a myself power kind of person, then you want to take that raw material, you want to put it through the alchemical furnace, and you want to generate your own realization out of it. And then what Ibn al-Arabi means because when you read it and he says this, you go, oh yeah, well that's of course. And that's why Lao Tzu said it this way, and that's why Meister Eckhart said it this way.
Mm.
And that's why this guy, like my favorite is Nietzsche. Here's a guy who was in the middle of a very powerful hallucinogenic ceremony and didn't realize it, and didn't have the shamanic tools maybe that he needed to navigate it. Because
Well,
I mean, I think Boaz might have mentioned that you've done a little bit with ayahuasca.
in my years studying anthropology, yeah, I did some direct, ethnographic ethnographic experiences with the
Uh-huh.
people from which some of those traditions have come to us.
Have you ever read Finnegan's Wake?
You know what? I actually haven't, and it's like it's one of the top things on my list, and not just a reading list, but like things to do is read Finnegan's Wake.
Get Joseph Campbell's Skeleton Key,
Okay,
and check out the videos about it because it'll help you not waste so much time. But my point is that this is we're really now talking about liminal spaces here. Um,
yeah,
we have an episode about liminal spaces. I don't know if you caught it, but it's about the plover because the plover is at the beach and he runs between the sand and the tide, and his whole business formula is based on that liminal space between the chaotic and unchanging and the stable and sound. And
mm,
that's all he does is run back and forth and pick the goodies out. And it turns out these liminal spaces are extremely fruitful places. They're like the middle place where all the fun stuff happens. Um,
yeah.
but
I wanna
go
ask you
ahead.
something really quick. That's been kind of I wanted to get to it in what I said last, but I'll make it more succinct so that I can hear from both of you. But shamanic, karma, providence, luck. Okay. You mentioned tiger, dragon makes luck. And I want to, and this is again comes back to language because my gut sense is that the word for luck in Chinese probably doesn't carry the same um, conventional definitions as it does in English. I'm imagining, and maybe I could be wrong, that it means something more like Tao or like what we're talking about. Like tiger, dragon makes the cross, the center of the cross for that, that alchemized human being that can flow, right? But in Boethius's constellation of philosophy, there's this distinction between the wheel of fortune, fortuna, and providence. So, and you also mentioned karma. I think maybe it's a karmic thing. So, what do you guys both think about this notion of coincidence or providence, or the liminal and things kind of appearing, coming into our lives? Like a teacher showing up, or somebody tells you go left, don't go right, and that's what makes all the difference in your life, or whatever the case may be. There's something here that it's like, oh, are you a lucky person? What does that mean? And it doesn't sound like luck is something arbitrary when the Chinese are saying tiger, dragon makes luck, right? So I don't know, like those constellation of words, like what does that elicit in either of you?
Maybe I'll go first, because Brian will have some uh, s- s- something better informed and probably richer to say about it. In the last episode we did about the Tao, we talked about kind of like the difference in metaphysics between the West and the East, and to the extent that we could generalize those. One of the concepts that really resonates with me from the Eastern metaphysics is dependent origination, right? Where everything exists um, because of the web of everything existing. Um, that might not be a a great way of explaining it, but I think in the West we tend to try to find these causal relationships. Like I was born because my parents met, and my parents met because but that's wildly oversimplified. Um, Without the Big Bang or whatever's outside of that, none of that would have happened either, right? So there's this interdependence of everything that I think ideas like love and karma, I'm sorry, luck and karma, love for that matter too, but luck and karma live in. I think those are descriptions of interconnectedness, and I sort of have a problem with the term luck, because I resonate with another Chinese proverb: "Good luck, bad luck, who knows?" And I think that's a really important thing for us to keep in mind when we're feeling really fortunate or when we're feeling really unfortunate is the context is bigger than we probably can grasp. Um, but um, tiger dragon makes luck does imply to me, as you're alluding to, that we can set ourselves up for a movement towards virtue, not necessarily towards what people usually associate with luck, like winning the lottery or anything like that, but with um, a more meaningful experience. And I don't know that that depends. Um, that that depends on luck, but that might be the luck of having the insight to apply oneself, right?
Circular, yeah.
Yes, it's circular. That's what I got.
Mm.
Yeah, this is an old idea. And the quest for certainty by Dewey is not irrelevant in this setting, because the thing that we're faced with always in life, and this is no different between, now and 2000 years ago, is uncertainty. Who knows what's going to happen? And we all know there's some bad stuff out there that can happen. And we've thought that if we could get the powers that be, whether they're gods or forces of nature or, you know, the mindless machine of karma, uh, then maybe we'll do better off. In fact, what I think is actually the case is that this is much more general. And they're saying that if you're too much dragon, then the tiger is going to come and bite you in the ass. And if you're too much tiger, then the dragon is going to come and bite you up the ass. So, so I think it's in that sense, I see it as an exhortation towards balance. On the other hand, we have this tendency to do what I call thingify, which Kenneth Leong pointed out the correct philosophical term for that is reification. And that is to make a thing or an entity where maybe one isn't. And so we tend to extract things out and at the same time ossify certain things to slow them down so that we can work on them. So, if you will, uh, this is what Bergson accuses us of slicing the continuous flow, la durée, the continuous flow of time. We kind of have to chop it and take a cross section out and use that cross section as an example of the flowing thing, but that in reality things flow. And what I get out of karma is that flow. We think we're things, but we're actually processes. That and that's why I don't know now that I'm trying to change the world as maybe in the same terms that I was when I was younger, because I think that the world is changing. That's what the world is. That wheel is turning, and I translate providence as this our ultimate identity. Uh, when was it El Hajj who said, "I am God"? And they were like, "Okay, we're not having that around here." Right?
Halaj was his name.
Yeah, yeah. And, that statement was not presumptive. It was a realization of the ultimate identity of the potential of humanity and the human experience. And it was ultimately kind of a humbling place to be if he really gets it, right? Because it's like saying, I'm not even here to a certain degree, right? And so you could read it as a complete surrender to God. Um, so so I think that there's something that's in the process, and at that level, I don't think any bad things can happen. I think that it's just, what are the rocks we stub our toes on the way home? and that each one of those, like you mentioned, this tension that we need to rub up against things is the process of that polishing, because ultimately God is El Rahman El Rahim. That even though we have suffering in a momentary way when we're in the world of bathrooms and restaurants, that's not our real identity. And so the only game really is realizing that ultimate identity. And I do think that, there's different glimpses from different ways. We did an episode about this. How many paths are there up the mountain top? And is it one mountain, or are they climbing different mountains? And I think that we know the true coin because we recognize the same mountainness in it. And regardless of language, regardless of culture, regardless of, so,
Sure.
because we didn't talk about Ibn al-Arabi yet, who is the dude as far as I'm concerned. But go ahead, Boaz.
Well, so that's the question. I'm gonna have to drop off in a couple of minutes. Do you want to land the plane, or do you want to continue and get into other topics?
Well, I mean, I think we've probably done whipped this horse pretty good. If there's things that you're thinking of, Joshua, that we should bring up, uh, I would like to do to give you a chance to give another pitch for the club, because I do think that one of the ways when we want to go into this
Let's do.
examined life.
Oh, go ahead. Sorry, Brian.
Yeah. When we want to go into this examined life, it is an effort. We do have to go through a certain push. And the idea of having other people there that we're kind of doing this with, in Buddhism, we call this the Sangha, right? But this idea of having other people that come along with us actually does help us a little bit. It's like if you're running with a few friends and it's raining, you're more likely to run than if it was just you might stay home, this kind of thing. That there is something that bringing and also that the process that we do on this raw material is very involved with dialectic.
Yeah.
This mining out of new information and translating it to our real living experience is really tangled up with dialectic in a way we haven't really unfolded. I mean, we've touched on 100 different conversations that we haven't unfolded because this field is so rich and it's such a broad herencia, right? Such a broad heritage. And I say that because, this idea of herencia means that people went before us and they gave this to us. They bled, they lived through this to give it to us. So it's a rich thing. And this is part of my feelings about subjectivity, and subjectivity is not the bad word. Like, same with prejudice. Gadamer is trying to renew the term prejudice, because it's not all a bad thing. It's actually an aspect of who we are and how we unfold the world,
Yeah.
so.
Yeah.
But
So
Discernment.
Joshua, let's leave you with um the the question, um how do people get a hold of you, learn more about Logos, learn more about your work?
Yeah, well, Logos is easy. And logospublishing.com is the website. Also, we have the Instagram channel that we, put out a lot of really interesting content that I think people find valuable on a regular basis there. We have the YouTube channel, which is starting to grow now. We have the Logos Talks that come out once a month that I'm facilitating. And then I have my own, if you just search my name, you can find me on LinkedIn or Instagram. And so everything's there, and at any point in time, people can join the club. It takes, if you were to join, you signed up today, you would receive your first book in the beginning of August, because it's on that monthly schedule. So that's something that people, they're not used to the subscription model necessarily, so it takes some getting used to, but then once you get into the flow of things, then it becomes, seamless, and people are really enjoying the books. And we also, we've just launched a Discord channel, so people are able to connect there and create their own little discussions and channels to talk about the different texts or different things that they want to, or regionally, people are want to get together and start a book club. That's something that I think that on the horizon I'd love to facilitate, for and you give people the tools to be able to make that happen. And then I do feel though that I really want to just kind of end on this notion again of the personality. And I love what you said, Brian, about the fact that these were people that lived and died and suffered in many cases to deliver these messages to us. Like again, I have Boethius's Consolation here. So this is one of our books, one of our first ones, Boethius's Consolation of Philosophy. And Boethius was this was, in the hours before he was brutally murdered. And I think that Plato's allegory of the cave, what people oftentimes forget is that at the end, the philosopher has to go back down into the cave to free their comrades, or at least deliver the message, that hey, there's something else going on, there's something going on outside of the cave. And that's not to say that it's a one-time job. It's not like, okay, you get out once and then come down once. It's actually no, like I think we have to make that journey sometimes multiple times. And he even says, I believe that um, you have to remember, you have to have tools and a sangha, to remind you even of that light that exists outside of the cave. So it's a process. And illumination, enlightenment is not something in the Buddhist tradition. It's like the different jhanas, it's not just like you get it and then it's over. It's like no, even then, seeing reality, it's a process of cultivating reality. But then I think the final thing that I would end on, that I believe is super important, is remembering that these were people that wrote these texts, and that even Plato, somebody as you know megalithic in a sense, is the cornerstone of how we perceive our history, our literary history, our philosophical history. Um, that he had a personality, and that when you really develop a relationship with the text, yeah, the person's not physically here if you had a conversation with them, but you get these glimpses of like who this guy was, and that they were a person, and that you can have and then eventually you can have a conversation with them once you give their work its due, and you surrender to it a little bit, and you speak it out loud, and you give it its time, that you have the opportunity to meet some of these people. And I think that's what's really interesting.
Beautiful. Thank you, Joshua. Really appreciate you joining us today.
And we will put all the contact information in the description of this video also for
Excellent. Thank you for
interested
having me. It's been
pursuers.
wonderful. Mhm.
Yeah,
Great
enjoyed it a
experience.
lot. Uh,